Hello, and welcome to Things You Didn't Know. With my son Jeffrey and my son Stan the Younger, I'm Stan Hitchens, and today we're in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. Our story begins in 1793 when the son of a prosperous Quaker farming family by the name of Isaac Pennock opens an iron mill about 4 miles south of here on a little stream called Buck Run. Now, this iron mill manufactured things like wagon wheel rims, barrel hoops, and nails. About a year later, in 1794, Isaac's wife Martha gives birth to their first child, a daughter by the name of Rebecca, and Isaac's business begins to flourish.
It was around this same time that the Philadelphia to Lancaster Pike was completed. It was the first paved highway in the United States and provided fast travel between Lancaster and the largest city in the nation at the time, Philadelphia. The area today known as Coatesville was the midway point between Lancaster and Philadelphia and became a natural hub for industrial development. If you'll notice behind me, you'll see railroad trestles. That's from the Philadelphia and Columbia line, built in 1834, and only enhanced the area further.
In 1810, Isaac Pennock partners up with Jesse Kersey to purchase about 110 acres of farmland that sits on either side of the Brandywine River. This land also fronts onto the Philadelphia and Lancaster Highway. They purchased this land from a farm-owning relative of Jesse Kersey's named Moses Coates, and eventually this entire town will be named after him and will be referred to as Coatesville. The property possessed a sawmill and a house known as the Brandywine Mansion. Isaac Pennock converts the sawmill into the new Brandywine Ironworks and Nail Manufacturing Company and moves his family into the Brandywine Mansion. By the way, George Washington did actually sleep in this house in 1794 on his way back from the Whiskey Rebellion.
In 1810, Isaac and Martha's oldest daughter Rebecca is about 16 years old. And for most of the time while she's been living out here, she is hanging around more with Dad in the mill, learning the iron trade, than she is hanging around with her mother, Martha, learning how to be more domesticated and have domestic skills, something that was very handy if you were intending to be a housewife. Well, the Pennocks, they're Quakers, and they believe in equal opportunity for education for both boys and girls, and they wind up sending Rebecca off to a very good boarding school in Wilmington called the Wilmington Boarding School for Girls. Upon her return, she comes back, and in around 1812, on a trip to Philadelphia, she meets her future husband, Dr. Charles Lukens. She convinces Charles to give up his lucrative medical practice, and in 1813, they're married, and they move here out to Brandywine, into the Brandywine Mansion, where they set up housekeeping, and they lease the Brandywine Iron and Nail Factory from Isaac, on the condition that when Isaac passes away, he will bequeath the mill to them in his will. Rebecca and Charles move into the Brandywine Mansion and start a family and their mill business. Charles is a bright man who picks up the iron business quickly and builds up the mill into a prosperous company. Being a scientist, he's open to new technologies and develops new products. In 1818, the Brandywine Iron Works becomes the first company to produce boilerplate iron that will soon be used in steam engines and iron-hulled ships. Things are moving well for Rebecca and Charles. For the Lukens, both family and business are growing. Rebecca will eventually have 6 children. Then between 1822 and 1825, tragedy plagues Rebecca. In 1822, Rebecca's oldest son Isaac dies. Then in 1824, Rebecca's father also dies. 1825 was particularly cruel for her when her husband Charles suddenly dies and her second son Charles also passes away. At the time, Rebecca is pregnant with her 6th child and must bury a child and her husband and is left with a business heavily in debt. Overnight, Rebecca becomes a woman industrialist in a totally man's world, the head of a considerable iron mill, warehouse, freight company, and store.
Rebecca needed banks to give her lines of credit She needed to keep customer loyalty. She needed to get her employees to trust a female boss, and she needed to take care of the day-to-day for a large business, all while being a single mother and grieving the loss of so many loved ones. Meanwhile, to make matters worse, her father Isaac failed to stipulate in his will that the mill actually belonged to her, thus leading to many years of legal squabbling with her mother and sister and other siblings. Then Rebecca pulled off a miracle.
Rebecca is able to pull off a miracle. Right after Charles's death, the Brandywine Ironworks secures a contract to supply the iron plate for the first iron-hulled steamship, the Coatesville. This is a great success, and it launches the Brandywine Ironworks to new heights. It allows them also to practically corner the market in boilerplate iron. This allows the Brandywine Ironworks to have great revenue. By 1844, Rebecca is able to pay off the mill, pay off her relatives, and claim sole ownership of the Brandywine Ironworks. Rebecca has done the impossible. She's built a vibrant business after many trials and tribulations. The death of loved ones, natural disasters. When the Brandywine would flood, they'd have to rebuild the mill from time to time. She even did it through the great financial crisis of 1837, a giant depression that came across this country that closed many banks and many businesses, caused great unemployment. She was able to keep the ship afloat. There were many times where she couldn't even meet payroll, and she had to pay her workers with produce that she grew in a garden outside in the backyard of the Brandywine mansion. In the late 1840s, Rebecca decided to take a step back and turn the day-to-day operations of the mill over to her daughters and their husbands. I'm standing in front of Terracina, a mansion that Rebecca built for her daughter Isabella and her husband, Dr. Charles Houston. Charles Houston would ultimately take this business into a great successful mode for many decades ahead and build the company into what it was to become in the future. Many of the mansions you see here on First Street in Coatesville were built by Rebecca for her children. In 1854, Rebecca died. She left the mill to her daughters and son-in-laws and their descendants to run into the future. In 1890, the company incorporated and took on the name that we all recognize, Lukens Iron and Steel Company. Rebecca's company went on to become a juggernaut in the steel industry, at one time claiming to be the 5th largest steel company in the United States. In 1995, Lukens Steel was listed as 390 on the Fortune 500 list. It now sits on a 950-acre site in Coatesville and is currently run by a company by the name of ArcelorMittal. It is considered the longest continuous running steel mill in the United States. All of this due to a great American woman, Rebecca Lukens, America's first woman CEO, a giant among men. For my son Jeffrey and my son Stan, I'm Stan Hitchens, and you've been watching Things You Didn't Know. Our story begins in 1793, when the son of a prosperous burpy derp perp perp.
I gotta just. I'm sorry. Okay, right.
Rebecca needed banks to extend her lines of credit, get her employees to trust a woman boss, meet the... all right.